Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Center's Deputy Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of our fall 2023 events, a talk by Alex Hermann and Dan McCue on the state of the nation's housing. Before I introduce them, I want to let you know about a few other upcoming events. Next Friday, September 22nd at 2 p.m., will be the kickoff for Hack a House, a 24-hour-long online competition. The Joint Center is pleased to again be co-sponsoring this competition, in which graduate and undergraduate students from throughout the U.S. have 24 hours to complete and pitch a proposal for an innovative and scalable solution to address a key aspect of the housing crisis in the U.S. 4 prizes will be awarded, totaling $12,000. 2 weeks later, at 1 p.m. on Friday, October 6th, we'll inaugurate a new co-sponsored series of talks on issues related to housing and homelessness. Samara Scheckler, a research associate with the Joint Center's Housing and Aging Society program, will kick off this series by discussing new research she and her colleagues have done in Boston on housing insecurity and homelessness for older adults, who are the fastest growing group of people experiencing homelessness in the U.S. We'll then turn to a conversation with Samara and 2 practitioners that'll be moderated by Howard Koh, faculty chair of the Initiative on Health and Homelessness at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health, which is one of the series co-sponsors. This will primarily be an online event, but a limited number of Harvard students are invited to join us in person at the School of Public Health's Leadership Studio. This series will continue on Friday, November 3rd, with a talk by Greg Colburn, author of Homelessness is a Housing Problem, a fascinating book that came out last year. Lyndia Downey, head of Boston's Pine Street Inn, will comment on his presentation, and then we'll have a conversation moderated by Chris Herbert, the Joint Center's managing director. This again will be a hybrid event. The in-person portion will take place at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and we'll have a little bit more space, so others are welcome to join us. You can find more information about these and many other events in our very busy fall schedule on our website, www.jchs.harvard.edu. Now on to today's presentation, which features my colleagues Dan McCue and Alex Hermann, who for several years have led the Joint Center team that produces the State of the Nation's Housing Report, a document that the Joint Center has issued annually since 1988. As they'll discuss, the 2023 report, which was released in June, noted that while U.S. housing markets had cooled, home prices and rents remained at near record highs, while mortgage rates had also risen sharply. As a result, millions of people, including a disproportionate share of people of color, were cost burdened, unable to become homeowners, and in many cases without shelter at all. In this presentation, they'll both review the report's key findings and discuss more recent data showing increases in house prices, rents, and interest rates. Alex will start us off before turning things over to Dan. Together, they'll talk for about a half an hour to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions, which you can pose using Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions. Even if we don't, they're very helpful, so please don't be shy. We'll end at about 1:15 p.m. A video of the talk and the discussion, as well as Alex and Dan's slides, will be posted on the Center's website by early next week. Alex, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, David. I'm going to share my screen here and trust that if I screw it up at all, that you will notify me. So thanks, David, and thanks to everyone for joining us this Friday afternoon. Today, Dan and I are going to present to you some major themes from the State of the Nation's Housing 2023. It's only been 3 months since we released the report, so most of the prominent themes hold true, are still relevant, are still the major storylines in housing right now. But in some cases, problems, challenges, trends identified in the report have shifted to some degree or or more often have worsened since the release. So this presentation is our attempt to give some of those major themes from this year's report, but do what we can to bring us forward by 3 months and try to give you all an update on the state of the nation's housing. So here are some of the most prominent themes we'll cover here today. For the most part, we've bisected the talk into a discussion of for sale markets and challenges on the home ownership side that I'll cover, and a discussion of rental markets and rental housing challenges that Dan will cover. And then to conclude, Dan will discuss some of the key long-term challenges in housing that relate to the housing sector more broadly. One of the bigger themes from the report is that housing markets began to cool rapidly beginning in the second half of 2022, especially relative to the fairly feverish conditions we experienced during the pandemic when mortgage interest rates were at record lows of about 3%. But when interest rates began to rise in the second half of last year, home sales fell significantly, home prices and rents softened, and single-family construction all dipped. And that general storyline remains true, especially relative to the peaks of the pandemic era housing market. But you've also begun to see the market refirm just a bit. And on the for sale side, in no place is that more true and more evident, at least, than when looking at home prices, which have resumed their monthly growth. One major reason for that is that housing inventory remains at extremely low levels. So the number of existing homes for sale has barely budged since reaching record lows a year before. We'll talk more about the reasons for that in a bit, but weakness in existing inventory has left a vacuum in supply that home builders have been able to help fill to some extent. So new single family construction has been up modestly, at least into the summer months, despite the persistence of those higher rates and higher home prices. So those two factors have also made purchasing a home, prices and interest rates, even more difficult for many potential buyers. That was, of course, true when we released the report in June and has become even more true today. I'll then finish by discussing some of the implications of these market trends before turning it over to Dan to discuss the rental side of the market primarily. But to start, this figure illustrates the extent to which housing markets boomed during the pandemic and the rapidity with which they've slowed over the past year. So here I'm showing you the year-over-year change in home prices, which is that purple line, and professionally managed apartment rents, which is the orange line, from 2004 through the second quarter of this year. And here you can see the incredible rise in home prices and rents during the pandemic. So on an annual basis, home prices in the Case-Shiller index increased 21% in March of 2022. That's record high home price growth, exceeding any growth we saw during the housing boom of the mid-2000s. And home prices were rising nearly or at about 20%, 18 to 20% annually for a whole year. Home prices and rents rose for several reasons, one of them being extraordinarily robust household growth. So the number of households across the US increased by about 2 million per year from 2019 to 2021. And that remained at a fairly robust, though softened somewhat in 2022 to about 1.6 million households. If you look at the decade before the pandemic, household growth around 1.1, 1.2 million annually was much more common. So record low interest rates in 2020 and 2021 were another major factor in the rise in home prices. And these interest rates enable buyers to keep their borrowing costs and ongoing payments fairly low, despite rapidly rising prices. But when interest rates rose in the second half of 2022 and that continued into 2023, both demand and home price growth rapidly deflated. So over the last few months, home price growth annually has been flat or slightly negative, as seen by the purple line most recently, declining by about 0.1% in June. But even with that softening, home prices have risen an astounding amount since the start of the pandemic. Here, the purple line gives you the index change in home prices since 2010, in addition to the annual growth we were looking at earlier in that yellow shade, that yellow area. So since February 2020, home prices have risen 41%, which is reflected in the fairly steep pitch in that purple line that starts just after the start of 2020. But what's new since June is that home price growth on a monthly basis has kind of resumed its rise. So for more than 10 straight years, home prices nationally increased every month from about early 2012 into the middle of 2022. And then prices dipped modestly for 7 straight months through the early part of this year. And now home prices are ticking up again. So according to Case-Shiller, home prices have risen for 5 straight months on a monthly basis, going up about 3% from the bottom reached earlier this year. The biggest reason why home prices have leveled off and even begun to increase, despite interest rates remaining elevated, is the extremely limited number of existing homes for sale. So on this slide, I'm showing you the number of homes for sale in yellow, which corresponds to the left side axis, and the months of supply in the purple line, which is another measure of supply corresponding to the right side axis, and tells you how long it would take to sell all those homes that are available on the market that month at the current sales rate. So existing home inventory was already extremely low going into the pandemic in 2019, but fell even further as the housing market heated up. So in the most recent data for July, there were just 1.1 million homes available for purchase, which is the lowest inventory level that month in the history of these data. That's 14% lower than a year ago and 42% lower than the same period in 2019. If you look at the months of supply, it has risen a bit more because sales activity is also down. But even the months of supply is still at about 3.2 months, which is about half of what's typically considered a balanced market. There are several reasons why inventories are so low. First and foremost are pervasive supply shortages driven by limited single-family construction activity for a decade or more that preceded the pandemic. And that just means there are too few homes in the places where people want to live. Another reason for the persistent inventory shortages is that when home buying options are so limited, homeowners who might otherwise put their home on the market might be scared away or scared off from doing so, given the dearth of options. So in this way, low inventory can beget low inventory. Yet another major factor are higher interest rates. There are higher interest rates yet again impacting things, right? So nearly 2/3 of existing homeowners with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage have an interest rate on that mortgage below 4%. And given that interest rates over the past year have been closer to 6 or 7%, giving up that low rate to buy something at potentially a much higher rate becomes a difficult and costly proposition for homeowners who don't have to move, right? So instead, many of those homeowners will choose to remain in their homes for longer. So that's one major reason that inventory shortages are so pervasive across the country. These dots here show you the 100 largest markets across the country. On the y-axis, you see the change in active inventory from the second quarter of 2019, so before the pandemic, to the second quarter of 2023. And while the x-axis shows you the percent change in active inventory over the past year. And the key point here is that every single large market in the country, except for Austin there in that top right grid, falls below the horizontal zero line. So that means that 99 of the 100 large markets in the country have an active inventory below the levels from 2019, and that's as of the second quarter of this year. About half of these markets had inventories that were 50% lower than they were in 2019. So in some cases, that's true despite pretty strong growth in inventories over the past year. Because of these pervasive and persistent existing inventory shortages, newly built homes are becoming a greater share of the market available for purchase. And I just wrote a blog, I think it came out last week or earlier this week on that topic. The lack of competition among existing inventory has actually been a small boon to home building over recent months. So even as interest rates and home prices remain high, the annualized rate of single family housing starts earlier this year, right, had fallen to about 830,000 units in the first quarter, and that's well below the 1.1 million units started over the year in 2021, which was the highest level we experienced in 15 years. But over the past 3 months, through July, the annualized rate of single-family housing starts has hovered back up around 1 million units. So that's another big change since we released the State of the Nation's Housing Report in June, is this small recovery in single-family home building. Certainly, interest rate movements will play a major role in how strong that recovery is, how persistent it is. But it's encouraging over the short term because home building is needed to give buyers more options. It's also potentially encouraging over the long term because of the need to address systemic supply issues. The market trends we've discussed have pretty enormous implications for who can afford to buy a home. When we put out the report in June, one major storyline was the continued deterioration of affordability for potential buyers, despite moderating and even lowering prices, which is driven by this rise in interest rates. So between March of 2022 and March of 2023, interest rates rose from 4.2% to 6.5%, while the median price of an existing single-family home fell about 1%. To around $375,000. As a result, the monthly mortgage payment on the median priced home increased 29%, and total monthly homeowner costs that factor in things like mortgage and property insurance increased 20%. So if you assume a maximum 31% debt to income ratio needed to afford those ongoing payments, the required annual income for a household to make those payments rose from $97,000 to just over $117,000. And if you match those income levels up to the income levels of actual renter households across the country, the number of renters who can afford a home at those income levels actually declined by about a third in just a year, right? So, or about 2.4 million renter households in total, which really shrinks the pool of potential home buyers. And since the report's release, as I've said, interest rates have only climbed further, and now home prices are rising again as well, right? And this has pushed monthly mortgage payments and total monthly owner costs up another $300 through July. And the income required to afford those payments is up another 11% to about $130,000. And this doesn't even account for interest rates that have climbed up above 7% in late August and early September, which will only further erode affordability for potential homeowners and potential home buyers. Along with the report, we released 5 interactive figures and maps that allow users to drill down into a specific metro area or state and see how some of these key storylines play out in their market. In this case, you can see how homebuyer affordability varies across the country. And I think Dan is working to update those numbers now and writing a blog about it that should come out in the next month or two. But because of differences in home prices across markets, the share of metro areas where an income above $100,000 was required to afford a home increased from 16% of metro areas in the first quarter of 2022 to about 38% of metro areas in the first quarter of 2023. And that's risen even higher. I think it's closer to half of all metro areas in the second quarter of this year have a median income or an income of $100,000 required to afford a home. One implication of this growing unaffordability is greater mobility towards places that tend to be more affordable, a trend that existed before the pandemic, but accelerated during the pandemic before moderating in some respects in 2022. So this figure here shows you the net domestic migration from 2019 to 2022 in the core counties of large metro areas with at least 1 million people. The suburban or non-core counties of those same large metros, all other metros, and then non-metro or rural areas on the far right side. So in 2022, just over 800,000 more people moved out of core counties than moved in. It's about twice the rate of losses as before the pandemic. Instead, a growing number of these people moved into smaller markets and into rural areas. And that trend was greatest in 2021 when the pandemic heightened demand for private indoor and outdoor space that was more attainable in some of those places. But still, these trends were largely sustained into 2022 as well. If you look by region and state, you see accelerating net increases, net inflows of people into the South. That's especially true in states like Florida, Texas, and North and South Carolina. And then you also at the same time see accelerating net outflows from higher cost states like California, New York, and also Illinois. Beyond affordability and mobility, another implication of rising home prices over the past few years has been the unprecedented growth in homeowner equity. So aggregate homeowner equity, which is that big yellow area in the figure here, increased by 33%, or about $7.7 trillion from the first quarter of 2020 through the fourth quarter of last year, even adjusting for inflation. And that's about 2.5 times higher than the amount of aggregate mortgage debt, which has been relatively flat over this period. In their Homeowner Equity Insights report, CoreLogic reported that average homeowner equity was about $270,000 at the end of last year, which is a gain of about $100,000 since the start of the pandemic. So those who own a home or were able to afford a home have benefited immensely from rising home equity. But we know that all households don't own homes at equal rates, right? So, for example, households of color are far less likely to own a home than white households, and that's what this figure here shows you. This is the homeownership rate by race and ethnicity from the Census Bureau's Housing Vacancy Survey. Since 2019, we've seen pretty substantial growth in homeownership and homeownership rates, in large part due to the record low interest rates households were able to take advantage of in 2020 and 2021. In fact, homeownership rates increased most for Black households over this period. That's the red line on the bottom. For Black households, homeownership rates increased by 3.1 percentage points from 2019 to 2022. And that's compared to a 1.1 percentage point increase for white households. However, this growth has done very little to close racial homeownership gaps that remain substantial. So just 46% of Black households own their home in 2022, and that's 29 percentage points, or almost 29 percentage points lower than the share of white households who own their home. Hispanic households also have a homeownership rate gap of about 26 percentage points relative to white households, and also saw more modest gains over the past few years, just over a 1 percentage point increase since 2019 as well. And it's important to note that market conditions, right, especially those rising prices and interest rates, have the potential to exacerbate some of these differences, or at minimum make narrowing racial homeownership gaps only more difficult. Though deteriorating affordability affects all households, it makes home buying an even larger obstacle for households who haven't benefited at all from the run-up in home equity over the past few years. That's of course true for individual households, but also true when you consider the increasing importance of family wealth, which can be vital for enabling households to access homeownership. In the report, we discuss policy and programmatic efforts that have been put kind of in motion over the past few years that can hopefully benefit low-income households and home buyers of color. Maybe we can discuss that more in Q&A, but for now, I'm going to turn it over to Dan McCue, who's going to give us all an update on the rental side of things. So, Dan,
all right,
take you in and go dark if I can. There we go.
Okay, well, don't go too dark. So thanks, Alex, and hi everybody. I'm Dan McCue, Senior Research Associate here at the Center. What an excellent and clear depiction of the trends in the for sale markets and for homeownership by Alex. So I will endeavor to do the same as I talk about the rental side of housing markets. But I confess I come at this humbly because now is really a tricky time to claim to know what's going on exactly in rental markets. But I think bottom line, as you see here, the themes are much the same as they were in the spring, where we have kind of an overall picture of slowing growth in the markets, led by a downturn in demand and a continued kind of a ramping up of construction, or just high levels of construction of apartments. That's really affecting the supply-demand dynamics and hitting at rates of rent growth. But this is all under this overarching theme of high rents and lack of affordability that's really continuing to worsen for more and more renter households. So let me get into the first part of the story, the slowdown of rents, which we talked about. And the story back in the spring was that rent growth, this is showing rent growth on different parts of the apartment sector. Story back in the spring was rent growth has slowed, but still above pre-pandemic levels, and that has changed. Rents had pretty much gotten cut. Rent growth rates have gotten cut in half since the first quarter of 2023, and now really seeing rents down to 2.5% levels. Really slowing down. At the same time, vacancy rates rising, doubling relative to vacancies last year. So rent growth going down, vacancies going up. You can see the implication this is having for apartment owners, and on the financial side of the ownership of these units. Adding on recent reports of growing costs of insurance and the like that are cutting into the returns for owners. But overall, just a slowing of rent growth, kind of an overarching story continuing from the spring. If we go to the next slide, a similar trend to the spring is that the slowdown of rent growth is really across the country. So here we have kind of the regions, kind of examples of kind of the biggest and slowest slowdowns by region. You can kind of see the picture here of the range, but the difference has been from the spring that in the second quarter we saw really the slowdown in rent growth continuing. We saw the number of markets that are seeing actual declines in rent year over year growing from 2 to 18, extending from places like Phoenix and Las Vegas, now extending eastward to places like Atlanta, Austin, Texas, Jacksonville, Florida, seeing year-over-year declines in rent growth, which we were not reporting earlier in the spring. We go to the next slide. One of the reasons for the slowdown is really the slowdown in demand. And so here's our depiction of apartment demand. And showing how in these bars, this is the year-over-year growth in demand. So we see the growth in demand really took a downturn, starting in 2022, mid-2022, to the point where growth in occupied apartments went from a record high of 700,000 a year early in 2022 to a decline in a net decline of 200,000 apartment units occupied in the first quarter of 2023. So really, part of this being kind of a reaction to such heavy out, non-sustainable levels of growth back in 2021, where we had all of the, the normal household formations that would happen and, were looking to happen in 2021, plus all those that didn't happen in 2020, piling on top of that, really overheating markets. And we see that, through the rents and the low vacancies. But really now we're kind of in a period where we're trying to normalize after that. So we had a kind of a cool down, and now we're starting to see here that maybe growth in number of rental demand is starting to kind of get back on trend, but we're really in a period of an adjustment. So bottom line, cool down, but cool down from a really hot period back a year ago. But the demand side is part of the story. Supply side is another part of the story that's helping bring down rent growth. And here is a picture of the number of units under construction, both in terms of single family and multifamily. So the focus here is on the multifamily, the red line, just continuing to rise. So a huge pipeline of new supply coming online and set to come online in terms of multifamily units. We were talking about records back in March, but as of July, that the numbers of multifamily units under construction has continued to rise, and so it's actually topped 1 million multifamily units under construction as of July, which is highest level in 50 years of data. So that's really helping to soften markets at the top, the high end markets. If we look back again to a slide that Alex showed earlier of the construction, where he was focused on the rebound in single family starts, units being started, trying to see if there's any inflection point in terms of the construction, the new construction started, given that multifamily developers are seeing higher interest rates now, are seeing lower levels of demand, lower rent growth. Is this being reflected, which we've been expecting it to happen, right? And so you kind of squint your eyes and see maybe we've peaked in terms of this, but we still see pretty high levels of multifamily construction being started at that last valley. But we're really kind of keeping a close eye on this, because all expectations are as this is at this level of construction is set to go down. So this is something we're looking at closely. But going back to to our look at where we are in terms of rents and prices and all that, all of this new construction is really not doing too much to help the affordability challenges for low and moderate income renters. If we look back at rent growth, this rent growth rate, and we add to that kind of year-over-year rent growth line, the yellow thing, with the actual rent levels, we can see the impact that these past super high rates of rent growth have had on the actual rents that households are being asked to pay, right? And it's up over 26% since 2021. So just a couple of years, we're sitting at rents that have been elevated significantly, and so that's really making it challenging for households households that are of modest means. Because when we look at the new units coming online, the median rent is about $1,800 a month, and the typical renter household with an income of $43,000 can afford about $1,000 a month rent without being cost burdened. So we're seeing that only about 5% of the new units being completed are at a rent that can be afforded, that the median renter household can afford. So so it's being hard pressed to make any inroads on the affordability challenges with high rents and low prospects of new modest rent apartments coming online to help the process. And at the same time, if we go to the next slide, a more persistent, longer standing challenge has been the loss in the number of affordable units, the number of low rent units. So here's the number of units renting for under $600 a month, which sounds like not much, but it's really the affordability level for a third of all renters. So we see the number of low rent units drop by 1 million, over the past 2 years, the last 2 years of data, leading up to 2021, and it was down 4 million. So it's just a continued loss of these low rent units, which leaves modest income renters with just 33 homes for every 100 renters, as the affordability gaps and the shortage of low rent units is just adding to the difficulty of finding an affordable apartment. And so when we add that on to this backdrop in the next slide of cost burdens, we see how this is leading to an increasing number of cost burdens among renter households. The report showed an uptick in the number of cost burden households to a record 21.6 million households, renter households, cost burdened at last measure in 2021. We're waiting for the 2022 numbers to come in. Will come in very soon, but expectations that number will continue to be high. And the number of this also shows the number of renters severely cost burdened also hit a record of almost 12 million severely burdened renters. So a lot of burdens out there that are facing these still growing rents and the shortage of low rent units, adding to the distress out there for all but the highest income renters. If we go to the next slide to get an even more kind of update on the ways in which kind of the stresses are rising. We see in this box here the data that's come out since our report. The report was talking about the gradual rise in the eviction rate back to pre-pandemic levels, and that's what this shows. Really, that 100% is kind of the average average number of evictions prior to the pandemic, and we see how, with the supports and the federal eviction prevention programs and the local ones that pushed evictions down to 10% of normal back in 2020, slowly rising as these programs kind of expire and the assistance runs out, back to pre-pandemic levels. But we've seen since the report that they've blown past that and they continue to rise, back now above 100% at last measure. So really seeing continued need for the states and federal government to step in to help with as the COVID era prevention programs and supports are being spent up. And the states are there. We have $14 billion $14 million of state and local finances. We talk about in the report. Helping renters pay housing costs and for eviction prevention programs, but still, people experiencing homelessness is up. Housing insecurity continues to rise. We see this particularly with unsheltered homelessness, which is up 35% since 2015, and it's something that's very acute in certain locations across the country, places like California, Oregon, Washington, but not just them, places like Texas and Tennessee, seeing significant rises in unsheltered homelessness. Enough to kind of garner the more state and local resources in addition to the federal resources, fiscal recovery funds for homeless prevention, for shelters and services. But at the same time, another thing that we has continued to be to add to the strain on the shelter system has been the increase in need for shelter from migrants, which has really become a very strong, big problem across the country. As 2 million migrants released by border officials between February 2021 and July 2023. So, in the report, we talk about immigration here as kind of the one piece of population growth that's pushing back against the decline in growth due to decline in population growth. But it's really kind of in the short term adding strain. States like Massachusetts declaring states of emergency to house such a large number of people seeking shelter in this country. So it's a growing problem that we'll continue to monitor. It's not a short-term problem. It's an example of one of the persistent problems that has increased urgency, I will say, and as a way to kind of connect us with our look at other persistent long-term problems that are seeing increased urgency that's really shown up over the summer since we've published our report. And one of those is really urgency to address the causes and effects of climate change, namely the need to invest in the housing stock to mitigate damage caused by natural disasters that are happening much more frequently due to rising temperatures, and the extent to which this is affecting. Here we show over 59 million homes in high-risk areas that are in need of stronger codes, prevention measures to mitigate the damage that the inevitable natural disasters are going to cause and are causing. But at the same time, ways to kind of lower the carbon footprint of our residential stock with energy efficiency programs, credits, and weatherization credits for electrification of the residential stock to lower the amount of carbon emissions produced by our residences. So a huge urgent need that's growing even more urgent over the past months. Additionally, we have an urgent need to address the aging of the housing stock and the aging of the population in that housing stock. So here we see a chart showing, the number of householders aged 65 and over growing significantly, grew by nearly 40% over the last 10 years to 35 million households. What this means is higher, literally millions of households with people having difficulty navigating their homes and need to improve the homes to help people be able to live in them and move around them safely. But at the same time, the housing stock itself is growing older. Median home is now 43 years old. The amount of recent reports showing the structurally 9.5 million homes structurally deficient now, in need of $150 billion to repair the current homes to get them up to adequate levels, and a big chunk of this, the need is among low-income homeowners who will need assistance in order to make these repairs that policy must help address. The need to invest in the housing stock also includes this urgent need to reverse decades of disinvestment in underserved neighborhoods. And due to ongoing racial segregation, underserved neighborhoods are disproportionately those with high shares of people of color. So really, it calls out the need to invest in communities of color while mitigating the risk of displacement. So the current residents, may benefit from the improvements and not be driven out by them. Steps are being taken to promote fair housing and reduce segregation. The new proposed rule on affirmatively furthering fair housing is one example that we talk about in the report to proactively promote inclusive communities. But again, much more needs to be done to make these investments in the people in the housing stock to confront these challenges. And so I leave you now with just kind of a summary that, overall, I think you'll get, I hope you get the picture that, the last 3 months since we released our report, we've seen, a continuation of many of the trends that we talk about in the report. But really, as someone who, having helped put together this presentation of updating it, really kind of surprising to me and kind of noteworthy to me that, a lot of the challenges, affordability, chief among them, trending worse, since the report. So really kind of makes us want to continue to look at these trends. We'll continue to follow them. We'll continue to update you, as on them as we learn more. So I think with that, please, as this slide shows, please, go to our website and check out all the data that we're continuing to update and present on our website. But I think with that, I will leave you, and we'll look forward to hearing some questions. I'm sure David has some questions for Alex and I that we're happy to answer as best we can right now.
My main question is, how do you keep it all straight? This is, I think, my 7th or 8th year with the Joint Center, and I'm constantly amazed by this. And I do encourage folks to. We've gotten some questions in, and but encourage you putting questions. And I did misspeak earlier. We will go for about another 15 minutes, so we'll wrap this up around 2. A couple people put in questions, asking in particular about single family rentals. There is some data out there that's a growing share of the market, and they were trying to understand, at least one of the questions, the interplay between what you're seeing in terms of slowdowns in different types of construction. So what can you tell us about single family rentals? And I guess to add on to that, I know you've been trying to figure a little bit out about the role of institutional investors in that particular market space.
Yeah. So I'll give Dan a chance to catch his breath and weigh in here first. I think there's a couple of notable trends here that we can highlight. So investor activity in the single family housing market increased pretty significantly during the pandemic, especially in 2021. And I think driven by those incredibly low interest rates and fairly robust rent growth. Investor activity, according to CoreLogic, rose up to about a quarter of the market, so a quarter of single family home sales, and have sustained at fairly high levels even since. And that's above a historical average going back to 2010 of about 17-ish%. So investor activity in the market has increased significantly. On the kind of building front, I think that was mentioned, David. You've seen also pretty significant growth in built for rent single family housing. So last year, the number of units, single family rental units started, reached all-time highs of about 81,000 housing starts, I think. And again, this is driven by a couple of things happening, right? I think it's deterioration of homeowner affordability, which we kind of presented on and continues to persist. So in a need for space, especially as kind of the millennial generation continues to age into the ages where they're starting to form or continuing to form or increasingly forming families. And when a single family home or purchasing a single family home is harder to attain, there is a need to get that space maybe some other way, and single family rentals have become an important and growing kind of source of that market. And investors have noticed both the potential there, given the kind of sustaining of rent growth, and even as interest rates have increased, though investor activity in the single family market has decreased, they've still remained a pretty high share of the market, so about a quarter of activity. So I think there are a couple of trends that are happening there. I don't know, Dan, if you want to add to that at all.
I'll try. I was just scanning the questions, which are pretty amazing. Nice detail. It makes me happy to see all the everyone paying close attention, having great. I guess in terms of overall single family rental dynamics versus multifamily rental dynamics, which I'm seeing is one of the questions here, is multifamily rental is kind of dealing with a pretty strong amounts of new supply coming online, but it's very much at the high end. Only about 5%, I said, it has a rent less than $1,000 a month. So very little of it is low rent. Single family supply is, the number of single family rentals is actually going down. Like when we look at like the number of rental unit or single family units that are renters in the ACSs over year, it is kind of trickling down. And there's a lot of kind of back and forth between whether single families are rented or owned. And but overall, the number of single family renters is going down, but institutional single family renting is, institutionally owned is going up. And but it's expansion of the single family rental is not happening at the same rate at the expansion of the multifamily rental stock, and it's competing with single family owners and stuff. So it doesn't have that expansion from new stock, but yeah, so I guess I don't know. It's kind of the dynamic of like the whole single family rental market, including moms and pops and things like that are non-institutional owners, is kind of had been coming down as people were jumping into home ownership. So
yeah. But one thing to just reinforce that point, and Dan is right in saying that the actual like stock of single family homes has declined over the past few years, but it's really the composition of ownership that's changed, right? So you see an increasing number of investors getting involved in that market, even as it's looked kind of more alluring to cash out and potentially sell your home. That's one thing that's happening, and putting that housing stock onto the owner side. And I'll put a plug in. I wrote a blog on single family rental trends and investor activity in that market in particular. I think it came out 2 months ago in July. It's worth taking a look at for folks who are interested.
As Dan said, just a wonderful wealth of questions here. This one I think is going to wind up with Dan, which is a question about household formation, and in part related to, right, if you were seeing fewer renters, right, but at the same time home ownership is getting more and more expensive, like so a little bit about where are people going, but also as you look forward, at some of the demographic trends, we obviously have this booming of people who look like me. What's your sense of where household formation may be going in the next 5 to 10 years? And what are the implications of that for demand?
Right. I mean, thinking about household formation as kind of this give and take, right, between affordability of the market, incomes of younger households and younger people, and just general demographic size, size of the generations coming. In terms of size of the generations coming, there's kind of some, the Gen Z doesn't have as big of an impact, right, as millennials in terms of how big the millennials were relative to the Gen X. And so as they kind of hit their 20s, 30s, forced, we're kind of a big surge in young adults. We're not seeing that surge, but we all are seeing kind of incomes in a good spot, and we see kind of pretty steady rates of household formation. Really kind of took off in the later stages of like 2021. Something we're monitoring. I don't know if I have any good intuition as to the future of household formation, because I just see it as a balance of, rents are so high, right? And it's so challenging. The high rents are spreading, across the country. The high prices are spreading across the country. Alex showed that map of people moving to small metros, and suburbs and things. And a lot of that is to find an affordable place to own or to rent. And increasingly, as rents get high, that household formation. What's interesting is the household formation that I'd like to track, the household formation that happens as a homeowner, right? Staying with your parents or something, if you have the ability to, and saving up, and going straight to home ownership. But but yeah, there's a lot of different forces at play. You know, I will, you know, in the future have to have a whole, you know, research brief on the factors that are happening right now. But that's
I thought there were. Thank you on that. And at least one of the things I've learned from you is the other wild card here is what do we think is going to happen with immigration? Natural population growth is you know pretty much either stagnant or perhaps even negative. And you know if you can tell me what's going to happen to immigration growth, you're extraordinary. If you can tell me accurately and with confidence, you're a great prognosticator.
well, but I mean, can I just say that? I mean, it just
sure.
means immigration is, as we talk about immigration and both internationally and domestic migration, right, as being the primary drivers of population growth and therefore, you know, as a result, household growth, they're much more fickle, much more volatile sources than straight up, you know, aging of the population, aging of the natural population that you can kind of track as you age with some pretty stable rates of growth. You replace that, or if that turns negative, you know, the stable rates of growth turn negative as kind of mortality rates and the population ages. You don't have this big, you know, bubble of you know of millennials or of baby boomers kind of going through and kind of giving you this guaranteed growth. You replace that with kind of more policy-driven immigration trend, you know, growth, or economy-driven domestic migration. It means you have to be much more careful and less, you know, more short-sighted about what you can project for the future in terms of household growth.
Yeah, no, and I thought you know some of your stuff about you know household growth by different kinds of regions was really quite striking. Shifting gears for a second, just I was struck there are a couple of questions related to climate change that were in part, you know, have you ever thought about or are you seeing? And I think the two that jumped out at me was one, are we seeing any evidence, you know, or what's the impact of the rising cost of insurance, assuming you can get it at all, in you know, a lot of fast growing areas like Florida. You know, insurance is either becoming enormously expensive or unavailable. And then somewhat related to that, are you starting to see any signs of impacts of increased utility costs? So as you know, as the world gets hotter, presumably, you know, we've been tracking a little bit what that does for household energy consumption. So I don't know if this is something you've tracked or if you've got some thoughts on how that's either of those may be affecting affordability.
Do you want to start, Dan? You want me to?
I feel like I've been talking a lot. If you,
okay,
if you
I'll start and you can add. How about that? I think you know, these are both things we've tracked or at least follow to some extent, right? And at least some of them are demographically related, and maybe I'll speak to it. But Dan, as the expert, can chime in. I know Freddie Mac put out a really good brief on mobility as it relates to climate and climate risk. And I think they found some shifts since the start of the pandemic and where households moved. One as it relates to like affordability. I think it was two separate briefs, one looking at the growing number and share, kind of like we presented today, people moving to more affordable places. But at the same time, folks would move from some states, some counties, some places where there were certain kinds of away from certain kinds of natural disaster risks, but not all of them, right? So not necessarily too much of a change in behavior as it relates to natural disasters in aggregate. And Dan, I can see the wheels turning. Might correct me on that. As it relates to property insurance. I think this has become a particular challenge and a major challenge when you think about multifamily property owners, insuring these properties, those costs, how those get passed on to tenants has become a much bigger issue. If you listen to the folks who are doing that work at the National Apartment Association, at the National Multifamily Housing Council, they'll talk about growing insurance costs as a major risk and a major factor that matters for their operating costs and affects their margins. When you talk about energy burdens, I don't know so much the trends over time, but those are significant and most costly when you think about lower income households in particular, right? Energy costs, of course, aren't fixed by income, but given when you look at lower income households who, given the costs don't change too much, might live in housing that is older, might have more expensive in some cases heating or AC or different kinds of energy sources to heat and cool their homes, or less efficient appliances, and just from basic math are spending a higher share of their income almost automatically on energy burdens. Those challenges are especially acute for those households and lower income households. I think it's something we featured. Was it in this year's report or last year? Sometimes you get confused, but it's definitely something we've discussed. I think we went into the trends a little more there. I don't know, Dan, if you have anything to add to any of those items.
Well done. Excellent. Yeah, I mean, how can I improve on that? I think just as you were talking about the like insurance, insurance goes into the cost assumptions of developers who are looking for rental properties. They need to get these things to pencil out, right? And so you make it more expensive, you make it harder for these buildings to pencil out. It makes it harder to build, harder to run, harder to maintain, unless you raise rents, right? So does it mean less overall? It's part of the same challenge that's happening from the rising interest rates, right? That's rising these costs, making things harder to make work, so that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is sticker shock or buyer's remorse for people that go in, because as Alex, you mentioned, the number one kind of consideration a lot of people have is affordability in terms of where you're moving. If you're in a risk-prone area, you may not necessarily know that, or you're going there. So yeah, I think there's efforts to kind of announce kind of the risk score and the risk price and those kind of things to buyers and renters of places in high risk areas, because people are really looking at what they're going to be paying at the end of the month, not like what could possibly happen, what could it possibly be. It's harder to grasp that sort of aspect of an area with in high risk. So, but other than that, yeah, I agree with what you said, Alex.
This is bringing us up to a close. A wonderful example of the State of the Nation's Housing Report, as many of you online know, covers an extraordinary amount of information in relatively few pages, right? That I've often said that behind almost every paragraph is a whole host of research. It also underscores, I think, as Alex noted earlier, the important, or not the importance, but I encourage you, if you've not done so already, to subscribe to our blog, because often something that was a glancing point in the SON, or maybe even something that didn't even make it into the report, is something that we then can explore in more detail in the blog. As I said earlier, I am always amazed at both how much gets covered, getting to watch the production of the report, how careful people are, because it's something such people rely on, and as always, astonished at your ability to not only synthesize and figure out what this all means, but then to present it in such clear ways. I apologize to many of you who did not get to we did not get to your questions. As Dan said, they're terrific, and there are things we look at. It helps us know what folks are interested in. as since this is an annual report, when we start working on it again. But for the moment, I hope all of you will join me, at least virtually, in thanking Dan and Alex both for a terrific presentation and for continuing to shepherd a terrific piece of work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.